It was another ordinary morning as Officer James Mitchell, the chief of police, walked out of his home, ready to start another demanding shift. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the quiet neighborhood. His lawn, always meticulously maintained, stretched out in front of him. The grass, freshly mowed the day before, stood at a neat 3 inches. A perfect green carpet. He sipped his coffee, the steam swirling around him, and approached his car parked in the driveway. But as he got closer, something caught his eye. Stuck under the windshield wiper was a bright green slip, unmistakably an HOA violation notice. He pulled it free, his eyebrows furrowing as he read the words, "Improper lawn maintenance, $100 fine." He looked down at his lawn again, disbelief creeping into his mind. His yard had looked exactly like this for over 15 years. And there had never been a complaint. The grass was green, healthy, and well maintained. And yet here it was, a fine, just as he stood there, bewildered and holding the notice. He heard the distinct sound of high heels clicking on the sidewalk. He turned to see Karen Wells, the newest member of the HOA board, approaching with a tablet in hand. Karen had only moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago. But in that short time, she had already made a reputation for herself. She had campaigned relentlessly to become a board member and had been making life difficult for anyone she deemed non-compliant with her rigid ideas of neighborhood standards. "Good morning, Officer Mitchell," Karen chirped sweetly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I see you've received your first fine." Section 7. Paragraph 3 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that the grass height must not exceed 3 inches. Your lawn is approximately 3.5 inches. That's a violation. James felt his blood pressure rise, but he kept his voice steady. "Karen? I've lived here for 15 years. This lawn has always been well kept. And I've never had a complaint until now." Her response was swift and dismissive. "New board. New rules," she said, barely looking up from her tablet. "Your lawn might look fine to you, but it's not meeting our new standards." As she clicked away on her screen, documenting her findings, she looked up at the small collection of garden gnomes along the front path. The ones his late wife had lovingly collected over the years. "And these gnomes," she said with a smirk, "they're not on the approved decoration list. You'll need to remove them to avoid further violations." James was taken aback. The gnomes had been there for over a decade. A sentimental piece of his late wife's memory. And now they were suddenly a problem. He fought to keep his emotions in check. But Karen wasn't done yet. "And your mailbox," she added, tapping away on her tablet. "It's not up to code either. It needs to be painted pristine pearl white, according to the new guidelines. Yours is classic white. It doesn't meet the standard." James shook his head in disbelief. "This mailbox has been here for 15 years too. Karen? It's just white." She didn't miss a beat. "Rules are rules. Officer Mitchell. You'll need to fix all of these issues immediately. The fine doubles if not paid within 72 hours. With that?" She smiled brightly and walked away, her heels clicking as she moved down the sidewalk, undoubtedly looking for her next target. James stood there, staring at the fine in his hand, the weight of the situation sinking in. He'd been dealing with criminals his entire career. But this was harassment. As he walked to his car, His mind was already racing with thoughts of what to do next. It was clear this wasn't just about a few minor violations. Something bigger was happening here. And Karen Wells had just opened a door James wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. Over the next few days, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with Karen's actions. The fines didn't stop at his lawn or garden gnomes, in fact. They began to escalate across the neighborhood. Each one more trivial than the last. As he drove around the community, he saw the familiar green slips of paper stuck to doors, on cars, and even on driveways. Each one a product of Karen's growing obsession with enforcing what she called neighborhood standards. It wasn't long before James realized the fines weren't random, they were personal. One morning, after his shift, James noticed something particularly troubling as he walked past Sarah's house. The local ER nurse who lived just a few doors down. She had been one of the first to voice concerns about Karen's overzealous rule enforcement. But James hadn't paid much attention until now. As he approached, he saw Sarah standing on her front porch, holding a stack of bright orange violation notices. Her face pale and clearly upset. "Chief Mitchell, I don't know what to do anymore," Sarah said, her voice shaky as she handed him the papers. "These fines keep piling up. And I'm just trying to get some sleep after a double shift. They're saying my garbage bins were out too long. I was at the hospital all night saving lives. And now I'm getting punished for it." James's heart sank as he read the notices. Each one cited obscure rules about garbage bin placement, rules that Karen had only recently decided were worth enforcing. Sarah had been working long hours, often saving lives in the ER. And now she was being punished for the very thing that made her an essential part of the community. It wasn't just Sarah. As James continued to investigate the growing number of fines, he saw a clear pattern emerging. Mark, a firefighter who lived a few blocks away, had received a fine for his kid's basketball hoop, which had been in the same spot for years without issue. Mark, like Sarah, had been working around the clock, putting out fires and risking his life for the community, only to be targeted by Karen for something as trivial as a hoop on his front lawn. The more James looked into it, the clearer it became. Karen was systematically targeting first responders and essential workers. These were the people who didn't always have time to follow every trivial rule, who couldn't be home to deal with fines in real time. Yet Karen seemed determined to make their lives miserable. But why? Was it personal? Or was it a strategy to assert her power over those who were already too busy to fight back? James's suspicions only grew when he began to hear similar complaints from other neighbors. The elderly couple across the street had received a fine for their rose bushes being too tall, even though they had been planted years ago. The local teacher had been fined for parking his car in his own driveway, because it was too old and unsightly according to Karen. But the most disturbing part was that all these people, from Sarah the nurse to Mark the firefighter, had one thing in common: they were all hard-working members of the community whose hours made it impossible to constantly monitor every little rule that Karen decided to enforce. That's when it clicked. Karen wasn't just being strict, she was using the HOA as a weapon to target the people who couldn't easily fight back. The people who were too busy saving lives, educating children, or maintaining the safety of the community. And James knew that something had to be done. This wasn't just petty rule enforcement, this was an abuse of power. The question now wasn't just how to stop Karen, it was how to make sure she never had the power to hurt anyone again. As the fines continued to pile up across the neighborhood, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Karen's actions than met the eye. His instincts as a law enforcement officer were telling him that this wasn't just a case of overbearing rule enforcement, it was something much deeper. Something that could have serious consequences for the entire community. He decided it was time to investigate Karen and her connections more thoroughly. What he uncovered would shake the very foundation of the neighborhood and expose a corrupt system designed to exploit hardworking residents for personal gain. James started with the basics: Karen's involvement in the local HOA. He dug into the records, searching for any unusual patterns or connections. What he found was chilling. It wasn't just that Karen was a new board member, her ties to the HOA went far beyond simple neighborhood regulations. James stumbled across a series of emails buried in public records, detailing conversations between Karen and a security company called Elite Neighborhood Watch Services. The name alone sounded suspicious. And after a few quick checks, James realized that the company was not only unlicensed, but it also didn't even appear in the public business directory. Curious, James dug deeper into the company's ownership. What he found sent a chill down his spine. The owner of Elite Neighborhood Watch was none other than Karen's brother, Tom Wells, whose security company had been hired by the HOA to enforce the fines and monitor the neighborhood. As James cross-referenced business records, he discovered that the company had been registered just 3 months before Karen was elected to the HOA board. The company's address led to a P.O. box, and its website was little more than a landing page with minimal information. Even more troubling was the lack of any proper licenses for the security officers who had been patrolling the neighborhood and issuing fines. The officers didn't even appear to have valid certifications, something that, as a police officer, James knew was a serious violation of state law. It became clear that Karen had orchestrated a deal to funnel HOA funds into her family's unlicensed business while leveraging her position to make sure the neighborhood complied with arbitrary and often unreasonable rules. The deeper James dug, the more the corruption unfolded. He discovered that the Wells family had a history of shady business dealings across multiple states. Their companies had been shut down in the past due to similar illegal practices. But somehow, they had always managed to slip through the cracks. Now, in this quiet neighborhood, Karen had found a new way to make money, and it involved exploiting her position of power to enrich herself and her family at the expense of the community. James knew that he needed more than just circumstantial evidence to take action. He started compiling everything he could find: emails, contracts, financial records, and even security footage that showed the unlicensed security officers blocking driveways and issuing fines without any legal authority. He even got a tip from one of his colleagues in the city council who had recently been tipped off about Karen's growing influence. The more he learned, the clearer it became that the fines and arbitrary rules were part of a larger scheme, one designed to extort money from the residents while funneling HOA funds directly into the pockets of Karen and her family. As the evidence stacked up, James felt a growing sense of urgency. He had to act quickly before Karen could do any more damage. The scheme was much bigger than he'd initially realized. And with every passing day, Karen's grip on the neighborhood seemed to tighten. But James wasn't about to let her get away with it. He knew that if he could expose her illegal activities and bring the full extent of her corruption to light, it wouldn't just put an end to the fines, it would dismantle the entire corrupt system she had built around herself. And so, with his mind set on bringing justice to his neighborhood, James prepared for the next step in his investigation. The corruption had been uncovered, and now it was time to expose it for the world to see. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and James could feel the tension in the air as he walked into the community center. The small room, usually filled with the sound of polite conversation and neighborhood concerns, now buzzed with an underlying unease. It was packed, every seat taken. Every eye trained on Karen, who stood confidently at the front, ready to present her latest proposal: expanded security measures for the neighborhood. She wore her usual designer suit, tablet in hand, already exuding that same air of superiority she had flaunted ever since she became a board member. James knew this was the moment. With all the evidence he had gathered, it was now or never. He wasn't just going to stand by while she bullied the community into accepting her power grab. The room quieted as Karen started her speech, explaining how these new security measures would ensure the safety and security of everyone in the neighborhood, citing her family's security company, Elite Neighborhood Watch, as the solution. She even suggested adding more cameras on every street corner and hiring more security guards to patrol the area. The room was silent as Karen finished her presentation, looking smug and confident. She was waiting for the usual chorus of approval to follow. But James had something different in mind. With a slow, deliberate movement, he stood up from his seat in the back of the room, a sense of calm confidence overtaking him. "Before we vote," he said, his voice steady, "there's something everyone needs to know." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to James, and Karen's smile faltered as she watched him make his way to the front. She was caught off guard. This wasn't a face she had expected to see standing before the community. James knew she didn't recognize him out of uniform. But it didn't matter. He was about to make sure she could never hide behind her carefully constructed facade again. For those who didn't know him, he continued, "I'm James Mitchell. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. And I'm also the chief of police." The room erupted into whispers as people exchanged surprised glances. Karen's eyes widened, her composure slipping for just a moment. James paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. He pulled out a stack of papers, documents, photos, and official records, placing them on the table in front of him. "Over the past 3 months, there have been 47 fines issued in our community," he said, his eyes scanning the room. 35 of those were given to first responders, essential workers, and people who don't have the time to jump at every one of Karen's arbitrary rules. The room shifted, a mix of confusion and curiosity building as the board members leaned forward, eager to understand what James was revealing. He spread out a color-coded map on the table, showing the exact locations where fines had been issued. The pattern was undeniable. "Do you notice any patterns?" he asked, looking directly at Karen. The red dots on the map clustered around homes that belonged to the neighborhood's hardest-working residents: nurses, firefighters, teachers, people who often worked long shifts or had irregular hours, making it impossible to stay on top of every trivial regulation. As James continued, Karen's face grew red with frustration. "But that's not all," James said, flipping to the next page. "This is where things get serious." He revealed a business registration document showing Karen's family connection to the unlicensed security company, Elite Neighborhood Watch, which had been hired to patrol the neighborhood and issue fines. "Karen," he continued, "your brother, Tom Wells, owns this company. This company has no proper licenses to operate as a security firm. You've been using your position as an HOA board member to funnel community funds into your family's business. You've been running a daycare from your home without the proper permits. And you've been violating state regulations by using unlicensed security officers to patrol our streets and block driveways." The room gasped in unison. And Karen's smug smile faded completely. She reached for her tablet, her hands trembling. But James wasn't done. He clicked the projector remote, and images of Karen's illegal daycare setup appeared on the screen. It was clear as day. "These are not just violations of HOA rules," James said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "These are illegal activities. This is fraud, extortion, and abuse of power." Karen stood up abruptly, her face now ashen. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "I've been working to improve this neighborhood. You can't just attack me like this." But the truth had already been laid bare. The room was in an uproar, with neighbors standing up, speaking out about their own experiences of harassment. Mrs. Thompson, the retired school principal, shared how her family had been fined for putting up holiday decorations 2 days late. Mark, the firefighter, stood up to share the story of his kid's basketball hoop being cited for a fine after years of no complaints. The floodgates had opened, and the community was united in their anger. James watched as Karen, now defeated, tried to make her way toward the exit. But the HOA president, Mr. Jenkins, blocked her path. "Not so fast, Karen," he said, his voice firm. "We need to discuss this." The vote was called, and it was unanimous. Karen was immediately removed from the board, and the community began to rally behind the idea of a full audit of all the fines that had been issued under her leadership. As Karen was escorted out, her face contorted in rage, her plans for control shattered in front of her, the once divided neighborhood was now united, with a sense of justice that had been long overdue. Neighbors who had once been fearful of speaking out now gathered together, sharing their stories and finding strength in one another. For the first time in a long while, the community felt like a true neighborhood again. And as for Karen, her reign of terror had come to an end, her reputation permanently tarnished, leaving her with nothing but the consequences of her own greed and corruption. The aftermath of the HOA meeting felt like a weight had been lifted from the entire neighborhood. James Mitchell's revelations about Karen and her illegal activities sent shockwaves through the community. And the consequences for Karen's actions were swift and severe. The board, once intimidated by Karen's dominance, had swiftly removed her from her position as HOA president. And it wasn't just her position that was in jeopardy, her entire reputation was now in ruins. With Karen's grip on the neighborhood broken, the next step was to address the damage she had caused. A full audit of all fines issued under her rule was launched. And the results were staggering. Over $100,000 in unfair fines had been levied against residents, many of whom had been victims of Karen's petty and targeted harassment. James worked closely with the board to ensure that the process was transparent and thorough. And before long, refunds were issued to every resident who had been wrongfully fined. The neighborhood, which had once felt like a divided and fearful place, was slowly starting to rebuild. Neighbors who had previously been at odds, too afraid to speak out for fear of retaliation, began to come together. Sarah, the ER nurse, was one of the first to receive her refund. And she couldn't help but smile when she received the check. She had been the target of multiple fines during her long shifts at the hospital. But now, as the neighborhood was healing, she felt like she could finally breathe again. Mark, the firefighter, was another one of the beneficiaries of the audit. His kid's basketball hoop, which had been the source of so much frustration, was now an innocent relic of the past, nothing more than a symbol of how far the community had come in reclaiming its peace. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed overnight. Where once there was tension and fear, now there was camaraderie and relief. Mrs. Thompson, the retired school principal, who had been fined for decorations during the holidays, began organizing a neighborhood potluck in celebration of the new beginning. The air was filled with laughter and conversations. As neighbors, who had once kept to themselves, now shared stories and built new connections. It was a scene that James had never thought he would see, a neighborhood united, working together to heal the wounds that Karen had inflicted. The transformation was not just about the refunding of fines or the removal of Karen from power. It was about something much deeper, the restoration of fairness, dignity, and trust. People who had once been isolated by fear were now confident to stand up for what was right. The community had learned a powerful lesson: strength came from unity. And justice wasn't something that could be bought or manipulated by one person for personal gain. As for Karen, her reputation was irrevocably damaged. Word of her corruption spread quickly. And soon, it was no longer just the neighborhood that knew about her underhanded tactics. Stories of her illegal daycare, her unlicensed security company, and her abuse of power became public knowledge, making it nearly impossible for her to find a place in any other community. She tried to join an HOA board in a neighboring town, but they had already heard about her actions and refused to let her anywhere near their leadership. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was a consequence of her own actions. A few weeks after the dust had settled, James drove through the neighborhood once more. The lawns were neatly manicured, the gardens vibrant with color, and the streets were alive with the sound of children playing and neighbors chatting. It was a peaceful sight, one that he hadn't realized how much he had missed. He pulled into his own driveway, now free of the threat of fines, and looked around at the community that had been restored. Later that afternoon, as he was watering his lawn, a perfect 3 inches tall, he saw Sarah's daughter run up to him, a handmade card in her hands. "Thank you for making our neighborhood happy again." The card read, with a crayon drawing of him standing proudly in his police uniform in front of a house painted in rainbow colors. It was simple, but it meant everything to James. This was why he had fought so hard, not for revenge, but for justice and for the community he had sworn to protect. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, James knew that he had made a difference. The battle wasn't just about exposing Karen's corruption, it was about bringing back the sense of community that had been lost. The neighborhood, once fractured, was now stronger and more united than ever. And for James, that was the greatest victory of all.